This is the Registered Behavior Technician course presented by Shaza Attar. The course content was created by Shaza Attar and is the property of Autism Therapy and Training, Inc. All rights are reserved. This training program is based on the Behavior Analyst Certification Board 2018 RBT Task List 2nd edition and is designed to meet the 40-hour training requirement for the RBT credential. The program is offered independent of the BACB. Remember, in each class, we will have our active listening, a quiz, and a competency assessment. Welcome to our class on establishing operations. In order for a reinforcer to be effective, we need to consider what makes it effective. Have you ever tried fasting for 10 or 12 hours? Without a meal all day, then it's time to eat. You hold that burger in your hands, stare at it before you go in for that bite, and slowly you go in for that bite as your mouth starts to water. Why do we sometimes value food while other times we don't? What's happening in that moment? If we went for a long walk and had no money to buy water and no access to water, what would you do? What behaviors would you engage in to access water? Imagine that for a moment. The topic of motivation is something that comes up time and time again in psychology and behavior analysis. There is plenty of evidence suggesting that behavior is a function of its consequences. So if a behavior does not occur, it is likely that there is a lack of positive consequences being produced by it. Skinner noted in his 1938 text that the presence or absence of consequences alone is not sufficient to explain one's inclination to behave. The value of consequences vary considerably across and, more importantly, within individuals. Miguel's 2013 article outlines the history of behavior analysis and motivation and how it has been approached over the years. Learning theorists use the term drive to suggest a physiological tension that would motivate action. Lack of water, for instance, would cause tension in our system that would drive us to behave in a way to satisfy the drive by getting water. Skinner in 1938 also used the term to account for the response variability observed during reinforcement. According to Skinner, a rat does not always respond to food placed before it, and a factor called its hunger is evoked by way of explanation. Skinner did not look at things like hunger, this hypothetical state, but rather looked at variables such as feeding and fasting, which are responsible for the variability observed in this behavior. Skinner initially used the term drive as a hypothetical state, since what was being observed and measured was behavior and not the drive. In his later works, Skinner abandoned the term drive for deprivation, satiation, and aversive stimulation. Researchers have emphasized that behavior may be a function of variables other than reinforcement. Like Skinner, they suggested that there may not be a need to infer an intervening state such as hunger between observable operations. Motivating operations, MO, is a concept that was introduced by Jack Michaels in 1982. The MO was used to describe how a reinforcer or punisher impacted our behavior. Motivating operations is an environmental variable that changes the reinforcing effectiveness of some stimulus, object, or event. It also changes the current frequency of all behavior that have been reinforced by that stimulus, object, or event. For example, if you're hungry, food items, snacks, and drinks will be more reinforcing than when you're full. The behaviors that you engage in to get food when you're hungry will become evident, such as going to the fridge and scanning it, looking in the cupboards, picking up the phone, and ordering food. Let me illustrate this for you. I have 2 cats. Both of them are slightly overweight, and the vet recommended I cut back on their food. And of course, They were not happy about this. This is Belle. She's about 8 years old. When she wants food, she starts meowing, then scratching things around the house. She knows she's not supposed to be scratching. Then she'll stand in front of you and almost start pushing you. And of course, we've reinforced all these behaviors in the past. She knows we will get up and give her more food. This is Hope. She's the sweetest little thing, but she will not give up. She will meow and meow and meow and meow and meow until someone gets up. She will follow you and meow as you're getting the food. She'll keep meowing. Once the food is in front of her, she's quiet. It's probably the most stressful time of the day. The frequency of her meowing is so high that you can feel the stress. What I'm demonstrating here is animals and humans learn to engage in behaviors when there is motivation. Behaviors will increase and change, so will the frequency of that behavior. But if Hope was full, she would not engage in the constant meowing. She would sit in her typical spot in the house and sleep. As human beings, we engage in similar behaviors. We may nag for food, pace around until food comes, scan the house for food. The value of food has increased, so our behaviors associated with getting food has increased as well. Many of our learners that cannot communicate effectively will engage in behaviors to access their reinforcers. They may leave the table to get a toy. To us, this may look like escape, but for them, they just didn't have the words to say they wanted the toy. We had a learner that was in one of the classrooms and he was crying and attempting to leave the room. The therapist told me that he wants to go into the other classroom with the big windows. So I said, all right, that's fine. Let him go and let's see what happens and let's see what he really wants. Well, he went to the other classroom, took the toy that he wanted and returned back to his own classroom. As you can see, he was engaging in these behaviors so that he could get the toy and not really escape the room. Some learners may engage in other behaviors such as aggression or self-injury to access a reinforcer. So when the motivation is high for an item, behaviors that have been reinforced in the past will begin to emerge. So let's unpack this a little further. The value of a reinforcer depends on motivation. If a child is hungry and you offer food, the food will be more reinforcing than if the child was not hungry. A drink of water after a long run or eating salty foods is more reinforcing than if you didn't have salty food or didn't go for a run. MOs have two parts: establishing operations and abolishing operations. Establishing operations are motivating operations that increase the effectiveness of some stimulus, object, or event as a reinforcer. When someone is deprived of food, food is established as an effective reinforcer. It is an effective reinforcer because the motivation for it is high. Abolishing operations decrease the value of the item in that moment. The child may not engage in behaviors to get access to that item. This is often because the child has had access to it and no longer wants it and has satiated. Satiation is when long exposure to a reinforcer or frequent access to it diminishes the value of it and reduces the overall desire of that item. So if you've had a good night's sleep, taking a nap may be very difficult because you've satiated. You don't need the sleep in comparison to when you have been deprived of sleep. Deprivation is when the learner has had limited to no access to the reinforcer. The definition provided by Cooper states that the state of the organism with respect to how much time has elapsed since the last consumption or contact with the reinforcer. This is a procedure that can be used to increase the effectiveness of a reinforcer. Let's look at these examples provided. Food deprivation is an EO that increases the effectiveness of food as a reinforcer. What this means is, if you have not had any food for some time, food becomes more valuable. The second example here is food ingested is an AO that decreases the effectiveness of food as a reinforcer, which is when one is satiated, full, and no longer can consume food. So here is a diagram I've put together to display what is happening with motivating operations. As you can see, the red arrow pointing up shows an increase in the value of the item because of deprivation, while the arrow down shows a decrease in the value of the item because of satiation. An evocative effect is an increase in the current frequency of behavior that has been reinforced by some stimulus. When someone is deprived of food, they'll engage in behaviors that have been reinforced in the past. For example, imagine you had a learner that said, "I want cookie," would get a cookie or pointed to cookie and got a cookie. These would all be behaviors that they had engaged in the past to access the cookie. Other children may cry and scream for a cookie, which resulted in cookie, and so on. The frequency of the behavior would increase when the motivation is present. With ablative effect, this is a decrease in the current frequency of behavior that has been reinforced by some stimulus. For example, when someone has eaten lunch and are now satiated, it will decrease all other behaviors and frequency of behaviors that would typically occur. So just to clarify this for everyone, as this can be very confusing, evocative effects for pain relief would be taking, let's say, Advil for your headache, rubbing your head, taking a hot shower, and other behaviors that you may have engaged in the past that have helped reduce the pain. While ablative effects is you would not engage in any of the above stated behaviors because the pain has decreased. In practice, establishing operations are essential when teaching language. For example, a child may not request for grapes if they're full, satiated, or if they've had access to grapes freely all day. You would need to limit access to grapes and reserve them for those learning opportunities. In practice, we work on teaching our clients new skills and behaviors such as academics, imitation skills, social skills, self-help skills, and so on. We want to be able to motivate them to work and reinforce these new developing behaviors. But using a toy or item that they are not motivated for because they have had access to it freely or played with it for long periods of time will reduce the effectiveness of that reinforcer and will not help you build those new skills. Varying your reinforcers is essential so that you can minimize satiation. So when the learner is deprived of the items, toys, or edibles, activities, or songs, whatever it may be, the value of the reinforcer will increase. But when the child is satiated, the value of the reinforcer will decrease. So when you're thinking of teaching your learner a specific request like trains or a cracker or water, if they've had it freely or have had it throughout the day, during those teaching opportunities, the learner may not request those items. When it comes to food or water, if they've had a big lunch and you want them to request for grapes, they may not want those grapes and so they may not request them. If your learner refuses food, but you're giving them snacks throughout the day, well, they're most likely full and no longer have motivation to eat them. I had a mom that was really concerned about her son's eating. She said it was often a fight. He would push the food away and she basically would force him to eat. He was on a special diet and wanted to make sure he ate well. I asked her, "How often do you offer him food?" And she said, "Every hour." The requirement was he needed to eat an entire bowl of food to ensure he got his nutrients. But for a little 3-year-old, eating a full bowl of rice or pasta or vegetables every hour may not be realistic, and chances were he was satiated and there was no motivation to eat. I asked her, when he is hungry, how is his eating? She thought about it, chuckled, and said, he eats with no problems. So we were able to problem solve that issue by not feeding him as frequently and making sure He was hungry. When I discussed behaviors and environment, I outlined the three-term contingency: the antecedent, behavior, and consequence. As researchers and practitioners saw the effects of the EO and AO, it was observed that they had an impact on our behavior as well. The four-term contingency takes the EO and AO into account. Our thirsty runner who has been deprived of water begins to engage in behaviors to access water. Deprivation of water is established as an effective reinforcer at that moment in time. The antecedent is seeing the water bottle. The behavior is he takes that water bottle and opens it. The consequence is drinking water and quenching his thirst. In the abolishing operations example, the learner just had a big lunch, so they're full, satiated. The instructor presents a puzzle. This is the antecedent. The child does the puzzle very slowly, unlike his usual time. The instructor still reinforces him with grapes. This is the consequence to completing the puzzle. Now let's look at the next contingency. The learner is still satiated due to lunch. The grape was given. Remember, this was the consequence in our previous contingency. The behavior in this situation is the child plays with the grape and does not eat it. The consequence ends up being the therapist telling the child not to play with their food, reprimanding the child for that behavior. When you look at the contingency, it's not the child's fault for playing with the food if they didn't have language to say, "I'm full. I don't want grape." Now, some other children may have pushed your hand away signaling they don't want it, but that's not always the case. When we discuss the issues with the single stimulus preference assessment, we have seen some children will take the reinforcer because it's there and there's no other choice. Let's take a moment and do a Scrabble word. The word is lek, spelled L-E-K, which is a monetary unit of Albania. We're more likely to engage in desirable behaviors when a strong EO is present. Preference assessments can help rank order of most preferred to least preferred in that moment. Rotating reinforcers or having new items may help keep the EO high. We also engage in behaviors when we want to escape tasks or situations due to high demands. Imagine a child working at the table for 20 minutes doing math worksheets. They're probably feeling exhausted and overworked, that they may crawl under the table to escape the work. Placing unrealistic demands and expectations on the learner may increase the value of escape. So we want to be careful not to increase the motivation to escape. So engage your learner with fun activities at the table. Avoid doing only work at the table and then sending the learner off to go play on their own on the floor. This will teach the learner that we work at the table and play on the floor. If you do that, the learner may engage in more escape behaviors at the table because that association has been built. Also, if you don't go and play with your learner away from the table, they'll associate you with work only. So the learner then may begin to engage in problem behaviors when they are with you. So be sure to switch things up, play at the table, go with your learner, and play away from the table, and so on. Don't be the one to increase the motivation for escape from your learner at the table or from you. Children that are not given a certain amount of attention may engage in problem behaviors that get reinforced. Take the example of the mom on the phone. Her child begins climbing on the shelf. The mom quickly attends to the child, getting off the phone. Here, the value of attention has increased. The learner is engaging in behaviors that have been previously reinforced. Attention diverted from a child may increase the value of attention. So you want to be careful that you avoid talking to another staff or others while you're working with your learner. Diverted attention may result in problem behavior because the motivation has increased for attention. You can give your learners something to do while you speak to other staff or your supervisor and try to limit these as much as possible. Of course, the learner needs to learn that they have to wait while others are talking, but this would need to be programmed for and addressed. Let's look at this example. The learner is deprived of toys and activities. This is the EO. So now the motivation has increased for toys. The toys are on the floor near the learner's table. What do you think will happen? Some children may get up and leave, crawl under the table, reach for the toys, and maybe screaming for the toy, and so on. The consequence would be that the learner gets the toy. Again, you can see how this is an issue and how the problem behavior is being reinforced accidentally. When a learner is deprived of their reinforcers for long periods of time or don't have the skill of waiting, don't have the verbal behavior to ask, we can see some problem behaviors here as well. The increased motivation for the toy, inability to ask, the learner will use whatever behaviors they can to get access to the item. So we want to limit these situations. So if your learner has limited language skills, be sure to give them frequent access to their reinforcers and do proper preference assessments so you can decrease that motivation to escape. Here's an example. The child sitting at an empty table, no activities or toys, while the therapist is organizing her material. The learner begins to engage in hand flapping and vocal scripting. Here, the consequence is anything can happen. The therapist may say, "Stop doing that." Someone may reprimand them, or they may get a toy following that self-stimulatory behavior, which now is a problem because now we've reinforced this behavior. Children engage in automatic reinforcement when they lack skills or are not in an enriched environment. If the learner is bored or alone sitting at your table without any toys, guess what they might start doing? You got it. Engaging in self-stimulatory behaviors. They'll start vocally scripting, maybe hand flapping, or any other self-stimulatory behavior they may engage in. So to avoid this, be sure your learner has a toy or activity that they like and that you know they will engage in. As you write down maybe something like behaviors, or maybe you're doing some ABCs, maybe you're speaking to your supervisor. Simply giving them a toy that they don't know how to play with or don't like will not guarantee that they will not engage in stereotypy. Sarah is an RBT working with Tommy. She is using the iPad as a reinforcer. Tommy loves the iPad. She's been working on clap hands for 20 minutes, doing mass trials, but yet the behavior has not improved. What could be wrong here? All right, let's break this one down. Remember reinforcement is the process in which an item is given contingent on a behavior, and it should increase it over time. Here, the iPad is given, but the learner has satiated. That's the EO. The antecedent is clap hands. The behavior is the child is not responding, and so the instructor needs to prompt the learner. The consequence is the therapist gives the iPad contingent on this interaction. Well, given that the iPad has been given contingent on the behavior and has not resulted in an increase in the learner's behavior, this could be because the learner has had free access to the iPad prior to your session, so the value of the reinforcer is low because the work is too hard. So what do? How can you learn to use EOs and AOs to improve your quality of therapy and to ensure that your learner is motivated so that they can learn? How do you create deprivation in an ethical way? So let's go through this. Step 1, identify potential reinforcers. Step 2, watch for establishing operations. Step 3, test potential reinforcers contingent on behaviors that are desired for increase. Okay, let's do another Scrabble word. The word is yow, which is spelled Y-O-W-E, which is a female sheep. Okay, let's move on. Reinforcers are specific to the person and depending on the client's age. If we were trying to figure out what a teenager likes versus a child, the items would be very different. I've listed some items that children may enjoy. Even for children, age is a factor. What a 2-year-old enjoys may not be the same as a 7-year-old. Some potential reinforcers you can try are So for children between the ages of 1 and 3, these might be some great potential reinforcers to try. Bubbles, water play, shaving cream, paint, Play-Doh, musical toys, light-up toys, spinning toys, cause and effect type toys, balls that pop out of a train, trains, cars, iPad, music, trampoline, and so on. For children between the ages of 4 and 6, these might be some potential reinforcers that you could use. iPad, Marble Run, towers, Lego, computer games such as Starfall, specific TV characters, animals, and so on. For children ages 7 and up, some potential reinforcers could be iPad, computer games, movies, puzzles. I think the best and greatest reinforcer is you. How you play with the learner, how you sing to them, how you tickle them, how you draw for them, and so on. I rarely use toys or activities as reinforcers. I like to do a lot of the social interaction and play with my learners. I like to do piggybacks and tickles and singing and dancing, drawing for them, and so on. I had a learner that loved flyers. He loved looking at the fruits. The challenge I had was he was interested in looking at the flyers, but didn't care for me. But what I wanted to do was to have him interact with me. So I started drawing the fruits for him on the blackboard, and he loved it. We got him requesting using 2 words in sign language for drawing grapes, drawing pears, and so on. We then were able to move on to other things that we could draw. Then we started cutting out the items from the flyer and pasting them, really expanding his requests and interactions. All right, let's take a break and do the quiz. Good luck. Which one defines a consequence? A, before the behavior, B, the behavior, or C, after the behavior? And the correct response is C, after the behavior. Which one defines an antecedent? A, before the behavior, B, the behavior, C, after the behavior. And the correct response is A, before the behavior. The therapist is running a program after lunch and is using edibles as a reinforcer. The child is pushing away the edible. Why might this be? A, the child wants a different edible. B, the child has satiated from the edible. C, the child is tricking the therapist. Or D, the child has been deprived of the edible and refuses to take it. And the correct response is B, the child has satiated from the edible. Giving a client any item following a behavior is known as a reinforcer. A, true, or B, false? And the correct response is B, false. The therapist is working on teaching the learner to request for water. The water bottle is always on his desk. What can the therapist do to increase the motivation for water? A, remove the water bottle from the table. B, give him juice instead of water. C, just wait and see what happens. Or D, none of the above. And the correct response is A, remove the water bottle from the table. Remember, you want to create the motivation for the item. If they're getting free access to the item, then they won't have a need for the water, and that's what we're trying to create, is that need for the water. The therapist is working on teaching the learner to request for water. The water bottle is out of sight. What can the therapist do to increase the motivation for water? A, remove the water bottle from the table. B, give him juice instead of water. C, feed the learner some salty foods or snacks. Or D, none of the above. And the correct response is C, feed the learner some salty foods or snacks. Now, there's something that I want you guys to always think about when you're using reinforcers. We haven't talked about this just yet. We're going to talk about it more in ethics, but you always want to think ethically. You don't want to give your learner anything that will harm them, whether it's reinforcers that you're using. So again, when we're talking about salty foods, don't give them a big bag of chips so that you can work on water as a target. Think responsibly. But what this really means is you can give them a few salty items so that you're creating the motivation for water. But again, always think ethically. I don't want you guys to misunderstand these questions and use these practices incorrectly. Always speak to your supervisor about the use of these items and the ethical responsibility that you have to the clients. Always keep those things in mind. The child has free access to trains all day, and trains are used as a reinforcer contingent on the program targets. The learner is showing no progress. What can the therapist do to improve the situation? A, put trains away forever. B, reserve trains for program targets only. C, some learners have a challenging time, so give the targets more time. Try that again. C, some learners have a challenging time, so give the targets more time. Or D, none of the above. And the correct response is B, reserve trains for program targets only. Way to go. The teacher has Johnny in the back of the classroom where no one can bother him. He often gets distracted and talks to his peers. Recently, Johnny has started shouting out and standing on his desk. The teacher goes to the back of the classroom and reprimands him for his silly behavior. What can the teacher do differently? A, move him into the hall. B, send him to the principal's office. C, give him attention for being on task. Or D, none of the above. And the correct response is C, give him attention for being on task. Remember, if you're trying to decrease the motivation for him getting attention inappropriately, then you'll have to increase the motivation for getting attention in more appropriate ways. So you have him in the back of the classroom and he's getting no attention by anybody, so he's going to start engaging in behaviors because he's deprived of attention. What you want to do is make sure that you're giving him attention when he's doing the right things, and you have to consider how often you may have to do that. This could be every 20 seconds, 30 seconds, every minute. These are things that you're going to have to account for. So if you're a teacher or if you're a therapist or even if you're a parent and you know that the child is engaging in problem behaviors to get your attention, look at the environmental events and things that are happening that may be increasing his motivation to get that attention, and you're going to try to limit those and change the environment so that he doesn't have to engage in those behaviors. In order for a reinforcer to be effective, it must be delivered immediately. How long should the delay be? A, 2-second delay. B, 0-second delay. C, no longer than 5 seconds of a delay. D, there should always be a delay. And the correct response is B, 0-second delay. Again, you have a little bit of a window when you're delivering a reinforcer, but I always recommend to people to give it as quickly as you possibly can. And of course, always watch for self-stimulatory behaviors or problem behaviors when you're about to deliver that reinforcer. The more immediate it is, the more effective it will be. So that's why I'm saying 0-second delay for this one. This is when a stimuli follows the behavior and increases it over time. Is it A, intermittent reinforcement, B, positive reinforcement, C, continuous reinforcement, or D, none of the above? And the correct response is B, positive reinforcement. Way to go. All right, everybody. So we just wrapped up our establishing operations class, but let's talk and just go into things a little deeper. I've mentioned Jack Michaels before, and if you don't recall it, here is an article by Jack Michaels that I really think everybody should read. And this article really covers establishing operations, talks a lot about, the details of it. So that is why I recommend that you do read this article. We really do need to understand the EO fully to really understand how it works in human behavior or with human behavior. So, when we talk about establishing operations, as we get further into our coursework, you'll really find that, why I'm emphasizing this a lot. And as you start to teach your learners and, you work with your clients, you'll find that establishing operations is really going to pop up in every single thing that you do. And that is why really understanding the concept of it and understanding what it is and how it works is really going to make you a very successful registered behavior technician. So, in this article, it documents that one engages in a behavior, they need to know, how to engage in that behavior, in that specific behavior. And they must also want to engage in that behavior. And so for behaviors that we're aware of, we need to know how to engage in that behavior, but we also want to be able to do it. Now, this really excludes those reflexes and the behaviors that are involuntary, that we have no control over them. So that doesn't apply to those. But it applies to the things that, when you drive a car or learn to drive a car, you need to learn how to drive the car, but you also need that motivation to learn to drive the car. And if you ever think about, why people do things and why people don't do things, why people learn things and why people don't learn things, establishing operations plays a major part of that. And you really want to think about, why do you do the things that you do? Why are you taking this registered behavior technician course? What's the motivation? What's the motivation for somebody to learn a new language? What's the motivation for somebody to learn to drive? Sometimes when, in most countries, the age of 16 is kind of that time where people start learning how to drive, or, depending on where you are in the world. But some people, when they turn 16, they don't really care and they don't go and get their driver's license. Why? So, motivation, again, plays a really important part in why we behave the way that we do. And if you understand your client's motivation or what motivates them, then you're able to use that motivation to teach them, to get them to do the things that we want them to do. So, for example, if you have a client that does not like academics, well, if you understand their motivation, then you can help them learn to like academics and learn to like to do, to get them to do their work, so that it's better for them. This applies to, establishing operations, and motivation really applies to almost everything in the world. If you are an employer, and you have employees, then you look at their motivation to do the work and to do the work right. So if you are a registered behavior technician and you're an employee, then you look at and you can assess your own motivation as to why you want to perform well, why you want to learn this so that you can get the credential. What does that give you in the end? What will you be and what will you give back to your own clients? And so again, I'm tying it back to you so that you can really assess your own motivation, so that you can really learn to assess other people's motivation. And, as we discussed, we've identified, deprivation and satiation as major factors in the EO. And, they're not similar to reinforcement. Remember, if someone is satiated, it means that they no longer value that reinforcing item. If they ate food, food is no longer valued in that moment. Now, remember, we talked about motivation and establishing operations as moment to moment. That value is from moment to moment, and the effectiveness of that item is from moment to moment. So right now, I ate, let's say, so food is no longer, motivating to me because I'm full. I'm satiated. However, maybe in 2 hours, I might get hungry again. So that satiation is now gone, and maybe now I'm more in a deprived state. So think about that with your learners. If your learner has been playing with the iPad and watching videos or playing games on it for the past 20 minutes, that motivation for the iPad may not be as high. And so if you try to use it contingent on behavior to get them to do things for you and to work well for you at the table, well, chances are they may not, because they're satiated. So with deprivation, the value of that item increases, and we desire it and will want to come into contact with it. And so again, if you haven't eaten for 3, 4, 5 hours, you're now in this deprived state, and you're going to do things so that you can get access to that item or to your reinforcer. And so you will engage in behaviors, and you're more likely to engage in behaviors that would result in getting you access to that item. And, when we're deprived, Jack Michaels talks about hunger pangs and a dry mouth as an SD for relevant behaviors. The SD is that conditioned stimulus that signals to us the availability of reinforcement. So having that dry mouth or hunger pangs will allow us to engage in behaviors to access that reinforcement. So, let's think about, a baby, for example. When babies feel hunger, what do? Well, they start to cry. And by crying, they've learned in the past that that's worked for them, and that's given them access to food, to their reinforcer. So think about that behavior and think about the SD. So an SD needs to be present. And again, feeling those hunger pangs or that dry mouth or whatever it may be will result in the individual engaging in behaviors so that they can access their reinforcement, because in the past it's worked for them. Now, tie that back to the clients that you work with. There are SDs that are occurring at all times. And so if they are, let's go back to the hunger. If they are feeling hungry, they might engage in behaviors to get them to that reinforcer. And that's why it's really important for you to pay attention to your clients. And, I talk to people about this all the time. When you're working with a learner and they are, let's say, crying or screaming or something is going on, we need to look at those setting events. We need to look at, are they hungry? Are they thirsty? Are they tired? Are they sick? What's going on with our client? And if we can associate some of the behaviors that we're seeing, then we might actually understand that this individual, when deprived of food, starts biting people. And if we were to be proactive and start giving them food or whatever prior to this behavior, then we're actually decreasing the likelihood of them engaging in this biting behavior and so on. You follow? Good. All right, so let's continue. So in our practice, when we're trying to evoke behaviors and we're trying to teach new behaviors, we need that motivation. You need your learner to be motivated to engage in the behaviors that you want them to. So if you want your learner to work or to talk or to ask for things, or even just compliance, if you want them to comply to your instructions, instructional control is a huge part of things. And by knowing what motivates them, then you're more likely to get them to, follow your instructions and do things for you successfully. So, as we start diving into each class further and further, I want you to really keep EOs in mind. I want you to think about, when you're working with your clients, what motivates them and how do you establish that? So many children that I work with initially, they don't talk and they don't produce a lot of sounds. So one of the first things that we want to work on is that verbal development and their verbal behavior. So I want learners to be able to produce sounds, words, and then eventually start asking for things and so on. And in order for me to encourage language production, I need to identify the things that are reinforcing to them. So this means that I need to use preference assessments, and we talked about the different types of preference assessments. And what this means is you need to identify the things that they like so that when you're working with them, you can use those things contingent on their behaviors. So if I was teaching them to, vocalize, I need to find things. So let's just say I discovered that they like goldfish crackers and they like pretzels and they like piggyback rides and they, like to listen to music. Well, now I can use those as, potential reinforcers contingent on behavior. And now I can monitor the program and the progress. If the learner is not progressing, then I might question the reinforcers that I'm using. The other thing that I might question is the EO. Is the value of the reinforcer in that moment high enough that it would produce the behaviors that I want? So think about that when you're working with your learners. And if you are currently in the field and you're working with clients, now they may not be children, they might be adolescents, they might be adults. You're looking at, is my client motivated in this moment? So I need to take them, to, let's say if you're working with adults and they have to do the dishes, it's a part of their program and they don't want to do the dishes. Well, how do I motivate them and how do I get them to engage in that behavior? Well, if they're getting free access to everything around them and they don't need to almost earn their reinforcers, well, then they're not going to engage in the behaviors that you want them to. And again, with children, this is the same thing. I want my learner to say the sound ba. And, when we talk about, SSPs and stimulus pairing and vocal, teaching of behavior, what you would be doing is pairing that sound with a reinforcer. So I would say ba, and, I would say this a few times, and then I would deliver the reinforcer. Now, if I am, and I've seen this so many times where the learner is sitting there and the person pulls out a book and they're saying ba, 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 and, they then give them this book. But the learner, takes the book and they throw it off to the side, or they don't really flip the pages. They don't really care for it. Well, the question that I usually throw out to RBTs there is, do you think your learner is motivated for this item? And if the answer is no, then you're not going to get the right behavior. If they've been playing with this item for a long period of time, then it's not going to be effective. You need to create that state of deprivation. And so how do you do that? Well, we talked about this, and I'm trying to remind you so that you can really put this into practice. So I want you guys to go into the environments that you work. And if you're not currently working in the field, then I want you to eventually analyze and assess the environment that you're in. I want you to walk into the room that you do therapy in. And, I'm visualizing the therapy sessions that we have in the rooms that we have. And sometimes what happens when I walk in to the room, and usually what I'll say to the therapist is, what happened here? Looks like a tornado hit this room. And what I want them to do is pay attention to how the room looks. And if it looks like, there's toys all over the room and, there's a toy here and a toy there, and then the learner is not, the learner can access anything that they want in the room. Nothing is controlled. And in order for them to be deprived, they have to not have free access to everything in the room. Things need to be in locked shelves or up high on a shelf, or maybe it's in a bin behind your back. So, pay attention to where the reinforcers are and how they're accessing it. If you have, let's say you're putting edibles on the table and the learner can just freely take an edible and put it into their mouth, well, then you're not controlling that reinforcer. So doing things like putting them into little containers, or we had one learner, who was stealing the reinforcers off of the table by literally like leaping over the therapist and taking the reinforcer. Well, if we're able to create some blockage so that the learner cannot get that item. So clearly he wants the item. He's showing signs of motivation for the item. But now what's lacking here is the control, the instructional control, and we're going to talk about that. But what I want you to focus on here is that the motivation is present and I can see it. I had a learner where I'm holding, two reinforcers out in front of them and their eyes are looking at the reinforcer. That tells me that they're motivated for that item. Another way that I can assess for motivation is to provide freebies. So don't be afraid of doing that. Give a small sample of the reinforcer. If, it was music, I'm going to play music for 10 seconds. If it's a video, I'm going to play a video for 15 seconds. If it's an edible, I'm going to give them a small piece of it. I'm not going to fill them up on that reinforcer, that edible, whatever it may be. I want to give them just a small amount so that they can, consume it. And then what I would do is I'm going to assess and see whether or not, they like it or they want more of it. And I can tell by their behavior. Now I'm really in tune to their behavior. Are they looking at it? Are they reaching? Are they, you see it, like if you've ever worked, and I'm talking more about young children here because, again, that's the population I work with. But if you've ever seen, children, they'll do everything and they're almost like planning in their head, how am I going to get to that reinforcer? But that would show us signs of it. But in order for you to get that motivation and ensure that you've got that motivation there is you've got to allow the individual to get into a state of deprivation before that you start using that reinforcer. So again, we're talking about our specific environment, but what if they're at home and they're getting free access to, let's say they like Oreo cookies and they're getting Oreo cookies all day? Well, they might come to your session and let's say you have a 2-hour session with them, or you're going into their home to do this 2-hour session and you're trying to use the Oreo cookies. Well, they may not be as effective because they just had free access to them. And so, realistically, why work for the Oreo cookie if I've just gotten them for free before? So think about that and think about your reinforcers and think about the state of your client in that moment. Have they satiated? Are they still deprived? And if that's the case, then now you can actually use the items contingent on behavior. And as we talked about in reinforcement, if you use the again, we're going to call it a potential reinforcer here. If you're using the potential reinforcer contingent on behavior and that behavior is not improving over time, that tells you that the reinforcer is not effective. Something is going on there. So you need to speak to your supervisor about that. And now throughout the course, I'm going to constantly talk to you guys about, approaching your supervisor. We do have a full class talking about, seeking guidance from your supervisor and talking to your supervisor when, where, and how. But in each and every single class, I want you guys to always remember that it is your responsibility to seek direction. And it is something that you need to be doing because you are a paraprofessional and this is a part of the requirement as an RBT. And if you fail to do so, then things could go wrong. And that's what we really want to avoid here. We want to protect you, and when I say we, I'm talking about like the whole field here. I'm talking about, the BACB. They want to protect you. They want to make sure that you're engaging in ethical behaviors, that you're acting as a professional person so that you don't do the wrong thing and get into trouble. Someone files a complaint against you because you did something incorrectly. So I want you to keep that in mind every single time that we talk about any topic You know, so I'll give you an example here. Suppose your supervisor said to you, we need to increase the EO, for this individual. And so what we're going to do is we're going to deprive them of all food throughout the day. And then what you're going to do is, provide the food only if they make a sound. Okay. So suppose your supervisor said that to you. What would your gut be telling you right now? I really hope that your gut is saying to you, oh my goodness, no, I can't do that. So yes, EOs are important, but what's always important is you engaging in ethical behavior as well. Again, throughout the class, I'm going to be talking about ethics, and I'm going to throw it in there. So you need to seek, your supervisor to ensure that you are engaging in the right things as a paraprofessional. But the other thing is, what if your supervisor is asking you to do something that is unethical, or your gut tells you something, but you think maybe I should just listen to my supervisor because it states in the ethical code that I need to listen to my supervisor? Well, you need to also listen to your gut, and if something is unethical and you're putting your client in danger of any sorts, you need to speak to somebody else. So you might have to seek another supervisor, and we'll talk about that more as we get into supervision and ethics. But I want you to keep that in mind, that you should never ever put your client in a dangerous situation or do something unethical just because you're trying to establish motivation here, or you are trying to reinforce behavior, or whatever it might be. So keep that in mind as you go throughout this course. So 1, you want to always seek your supervisor, and 2, you always want to keep ethics in the back of your mind, and always think about that. Even if we're establishing operations here, at that point you can say to your supervisor, maybe we shouldn't withhold their food because that would be an unethical, thing to do for our client. But, their snacks, their goldfish crackers, their pretzels, their cookie, their juice, well, maybe that we can withhold, and then we can, have something going in there. But again, if that's what your supervisor is saying to you, which of course I hope they're not, then you might need to seek their supervisor or address this with them and take action, because then at this point, we might be entering into, some unethical issues. And again, these things can happen because bad things have happened in our field where, BCBA makes a very poor judgment call, which has caused, death to an individual, and that's not what we want. So be very careful. So always think professional behavior, ethical behavior, supervision, and then of course you want to understand applied behavior analysis as a whole. So we're going to end here for today on establishing operations. And again, each and every single class that you will be taking will give a little bit of each, and by the time we get to our summary, then we're going to put it all together so that it makes sense for you guys and you really feel confident and competent in this, and that you guys can ace the exam. Okay. How do you use EOs and AOs in practice? Well, when we're working with our learners, we want to create the motivation in certain situations. For instance, if I was teaching a learner to request water, I need to ensure that they're motivated for water. There's a need for water. For example, they may need to be thirsty if I wanted them to drink the water. If I were doing water play, I need to make playing with water look fun. We want to increase the EO for behaviors we want, such as sitting at the table or completing work. This is done by decreasing the EO for escape. If you have a room full of toys and are trying to get your learner to work, you would be competing with the environment. Your learner may escape the table to go play with toys in the room. To fix this, you would need to decrease the motivation for escaping the table by keeping your environment organized and free of items so that your learner doesn't leave the table. By manipulating the EO, you're creating an environment that is suitable for you and your learner. All right, my final thoughts. Think about your learner's motivation. Think about the moment. Be sure to assess the motivation often enough. Don't run a 20-minute session and only assess the reinforcers once. Every 3 to 4 trials, assess the motivation. See where the learner is at. Do they want something different? Is that a lot of work for you? Yeah, it might be. But at the end of the day, your learner progressing and doing well will be so rewarding that your efforts will not go unnoticed. A lot of therapists compliment me on my interaction with the children and my use of reinforcers. And some will ask, how do you do it? My answer is simple. I listen and watch the learner. I can tell whether the motivation for the item is dying down, which means I need to start bringing out other things before the motivation dies completely. Why? Because I don't want the learner to escape me or the table. Before they satiate completely and the reinforcer is still quite motivating, I want to pull out new items or assess other reinforcers. I won't take a reinforcer away if the learner just got access to it. I'll present it a few times so they feel a sense of satisfaction. I'll also expose the learner to new reinforcers or things we can do. If my learner likes trains, planes, and automobiles, that's great. But what if we did trains in paint? What if we did paper airplanes? What if we built a car wash and cleaned our cars with soap and water? I think that's the fun part of playing with children, if you're working with children. When you're working with children, it allows you to be creative and play in ways that you couldn't really imagine. And seeing their reaction is priceless. So I encourage you to have fun. I encourage you to be creative. I want to thank you for joining me today, and we'll see you at the next class.